Last time we loaded in some objects into our level. I showed you how to handle collisions between those objects and the player. We can now load in some coins that the player can pick up. This time, we're finally going to code some logic to switch between different levels. But before we tackle that, there's something important I need to address about Love 2D's physics system. Do you see how when the player touches a coin, it disappears? Well, the coins are not actually disappearing. Let's go back and look at the player onCollision callback function. If you remember from last time, this is the function that's called whenever the player's collider collides with anything else in the physics system. Right now, all that's happening is that the coin's isActive flag is being set to false, and that means they will neither be updated or drawn. But the collider will still be active in the scene because it's handled by the world object instead. To demonstrate this, I'm going to go back to the coin object, and I'm going to comment out the set sensor. That's going to make the collider solid. And I'll run that code. Now I've taken a coin, but you see how the player is running up against an invisible wall? That's because the collider is actually still there. We need to destroy that collider somehow. How can we disable the physics body? If we look at the Love 2D documentation, we see that we have a couple of options. We can either call body setActive and set it to false, or we can do body destroy and just outright destroy the body. I'm going to use setActive for this. Back in our code, we have our player class, and where the player is interacting with the coin, first of all, I'm going to check to see if there is a body on that coin. So if other.body, then other.body setActive, and I'll set that to false. But when I do this, there's going to be a little bit of a catch, which we'll see in a moment. So run that code. Yeah, there it is. We're getting a little bit of an error here. So it says box2D assertion failed and world is locked. And what this means is that we're trying to change the state of a body from within a physics callback. We can't actually do that with box2D. I think the reason is to avoid like a chicken-egg scenario. So when we change the state of a body and then we pop that function off the stack, it's going to go back to the physics callback, and it's going to go back to whatever called that function. But if whatever called that function is disabled, then it creates a little bit of a paradox. So what box2D does is it just restricts you from doing that. So what we're going to need now is some kind of workaround. My workaround to this is to create a new Boolean flag for the game objects. I'll call it toDestroy, and when it's set to true, the map will take care of destroying the object after it's updated. So instead of setting active to false, I'll comment that out. I'll do other toDestroy equals true. In the map, where we're updating things, I could put it here, but the problem is this will probably get set to inactive, and then that will never get called. So I could do that afterwards. I could do if e dot toDestroy equals true, and we'll also check to see if it actually has a body. E dot body, and one more thing we need is to see if it's actually active still. Otherwise, it's just going to call this every frame. So we can do e.body is active. Then what we'll do is we'll do e.body set active false. So we can do that right here. Note that it's not actually being destroyed from the entity list. It's not being removed from the entity list. That's not such a bad thing, though, unless you have 10,000 objects. That's probably unlikely unless you're spawning a lot of bullets, but that's a subject for another video. But I think this is perfectly fine. It's just going to be in the list, but it's just going to be dead in the list. And because this is Lua, I don't actually need to define to destroy, but I'm going to go ahead and do that anyways, just to be safe. So where we're defining the coin here, I'll do to destroy equals false. Save that. Let's see if this works now. Okay, good. And we don't have any invisible walls now. It's important to keep all this stuff in mind because we'll be doing something similar when we switch maps. But before we do that, I just want to add some tags to our objects so the player can distinguish what it's colliding with. Right now, the player has no way of knowing if it's colliding with a coin, an enemy, or whatever. You could easily identify an object using strings, but it's better to use integers. I'll create a new file called const.lua. And in here, I want to add something like an enum, but sadly, Lua doesn't have anything like an enum like in C. I'm going to fake it with a table, so I could do something like entity tag. And then here I could do player equals 1, coin equals 2, and portal equals 3. Well, we don't have portals yet, but basically these are objects that the player collides with, and that's going to trigger a map change. Okay, now that we have that, I'm going to add that to the entities. So save that. And in the player, I'll add that up here. So I'll just do something like tag equals entity tag dot player. Yeah, this is just kind of a fake enum system. The whole reason why I'm wrapping it in this table here is it acts as a kind of namespace. It's not actually necessary. I could just have just the variables, but I prefer this. So I'll save that. And I'll do the same with the coin. And back here in the player, I want to actually check to see that I'm touching a coin. So if other.isActive, and we can say and other.tag equals entity tag.coin. Okay, because we're going to have more than one thing here later, so that's why we need these tags. And oops, I forgot to require that. I'll go back into main and just put it at the top. Yeah, const stands for constants, by the way. Let's talk about changing maps. The first thing we'll need to switch to another map is another map. I've gone ahead and created a new one. Back here in Tiled, I have this new map I've created using the same tile set as before. I'm going to export this out by pressing Ctrl-E, and hopefully it should now be in the same folder as the other one. As you can see, the new map is in the Maps folder now. What I'm going to do is go into resources.lua. As you can see right now, we just have this one global variable with the one map. I want to refactor things a bit so it can use multiple maps. I'm going to do the exact same thing I did with the texture graphics. I'm going to create a dictionary. The first will be Tilemaps 01. And the second is Tilemaps 02. To actually create the map at first, we're using this gmap variable, and we're passing in this map constructor, and we're using a definition. But this definition is now a dictionary, so I need to change this. And we also need a function to actually change the maps. What I'm going to do is use a keyboard shortcut to change the map. But you may remember before I was saying that if you do it in the update loop, it's just going to check every frame for a keyboard press. Thankfully there's actually a convenient callback function in Love 2D, so I'm not going to be doing this anymore. So this was the debug mode toggle. I'm going to be removing that, and I'll be creating the keyboard shortcut down here. Love.keyPressed. And that takes in whichever key was pressed. I'll paste that in. So we no longer need all of this. Just going to delete that. And instead of setting that to true, it's going to be G debug mode, so not G debug mode. So whatever, the opposite of whatever it was. And we're going to check to see if the key pressed was X. And then what else I'm going to do is, I'm going to say if key equals M, then change map. So change it to the second one. Notice that I'm passing in the ID string, not the actual definition itself. But we don't have this function yet. I'm going to create that really quickly. I'll put it over here. Another thing we need to do is actually check to see if that ID is valid. And if it is valid, then we actually change the map. Okay, good. But there's a little problem you're going to see in a moment. But let's test everything first, just to see if we can actually change the map. So I'll save that. Okay, we have the map from before working. I can press X to toggle debug mode on and off. And the nice thing is I only need one key press for that now. Now if I press M, we should be able to change maps. Yep, we could change maps, but you can see a few problems. One, there doesn't seem to be a player. Or is there? Ah, there's a player. Well, the problem, as you may have guessed, is that the camera still has a reference to the old player object. It doesn't know to look for the new player. And you may be wondering, if we change the maps, and we destroyed the player, wouldn't that cause some sort of nil object error? Well, no, because this has everything to do with how Lua's garbage collector works. As long as an object has a reference to an object in Lua, it's not going to be destroyed, and the camera still has a reference to the player. That's why this whole thing isn't crashing, and that's one thing you really have to be careful about. The other thing is, there seems to be a whole bunch of invisible objects in the scene. Well, this has everything to do with what I said about the physics system before. The colliders are not actually being destroyed. So we actually need to unload the previous map. Let's create a map unload function now. Actually, the first thing I'm going to do is reset that camera. I'm just simply going to take these two lines right here and just paste them right after I load the new map. Now, I'm actually going to create the map unload function here in map.lua. I think I'll put it right around here. Why not? What I'll do is go through all my entities, and I'll see if the entity actually has a body first. And I'm just going to permanently destroy it this time. And then I also need to get rid of my walls. If you remember before, all the walls are in the map is just this body right here, this one body. That body has all of the shapes, which are the walls, but I think if we just destroy the map's body, that should be good enough. Yeah, you may notice that I'm not destroying the physics world. I could do that too every time I unload a map, but I think I'm just going to keep the physics world around. I'm only going to destroy the bodies. You know, maybe if you want to be thorough with flushing your references and flushing your objects, you might want to destroy the world. I don't think that's going to be necessary, though. It really comes down to personal preference, I think. Okay, let's add that to our change map function. So in here, I'm going to say if gmap, then gmap unload. Okay, save that. Let's test it now. I'm going to change maps again by pressing M. Okay, well, the camera seems to be in the right place, and it's following the player. Do we have any more invisible objects? I don't think so. And all the colliders seem to be correct. Good. But right now we're using the keyboard to change maps. In actual game, we don't want that. We want the player to be able to collide with a trigger box or something, and that's going to change the map. So let's tackle that next. Just a quick addition. There's another way we could destroy all the bodies. We could actually get all the bodies in the physics world and destroy them. That may be better in some cases, so I'll show you that. I'll comment out this. And I'll get all the bodies. First, let's check to see if it's actually destroyed. And destroy it. There, I think that should work well. Okay, back here in Tiled, I've changed my maps a little bit. I've added these coins right here, just so I have something that's loaded in here. But more importantly, I have this portal object. And what this is when the player collides with this thing, there's going to be an ID on here, which tells the map loader what map to load. And then it's going to change the map. But you may also notice I have a player spawn. And what that is, if we look at the other map, there's a portal here and then there's a player spawn. So this is going to have a map ID and it's going to have a spawn ID. And that's going to tell the map loader where to position the player. So it's going to look for the ID of this thing and then position the player there. And we'll also have a direction for the player to be facing. Because there could be more than one player spawns in the map. We may not want to position the player in the same place every single time. It really depends. Like maybe the player is coming from this direction, so we want to spawn the player here. And you may notice one other thing, I still have my player. But I'm going to actually leave that in, because what I want to do is have it so that if there are no player spawns, then this thing will be loaded instead. So that's going to be okay. So let's go ahead and add some data to these. So I have my portal object, but there's no ID. I could actually add that in Tile by going in here and then saying add property. And it's going to be a string, and it's going to be, well, I'll call it map ID. And it's going to be whatever IDs we have in that dictionary. I think it was city map 01. And then we'll need a spawn ID as well. So that is going to be spawn ID, and we'll just say entrance. And we actually need to change this spawn now, so I'm going to call this one add a property, and it's just going to be ID entrance. And the same with this. This one's also going to be ID entrance. And the other thing we need is a direction. I could add that in here. Well, I could also use an int, but I guess for simplicity I'll just say string. It'll be direction. Right. And I could actually copy and paste that. So over here I could copy and paste this in. And that will be left, because we want the player to be facing left. And then this thing right here, well, that's also going to need some stuff, so I could just copy these and put them in. And I'll change this to city map 2. And I think we're done. Let's export those. Now I'm going to create the portal objects the exact same way I created the coins. In fact, the code is going to be almost identical, so I'll just copy and paste it. And instead of checking for coin, we'll be checking for portal. And one difference is it's going to have its own width and height, so I'll do that. Another thing is we won't actually see the portal, so we don't need any of this visual stuff right here. I think I want to leave the rest, and I want to change the tag. So we already have that portal tag from before. Add that in. I think the rest of this looks fine. Static, okay. And one thing we do need to change is this. So once again, it has its own width and height. And the other thing is the offset. So you probably remember from the walls, we need to offset it by half, because with Box 2D, the shape is going to come from the center of the object, so we need to have that. I don't know why it does that. Okay, I think that should be fine. And we do want it to be a sensor this time, so I'm going to uncomment that out. Okay. And then the other thing we need to add is the spawn points. I'm actually going to have the map keep track of its own spawn points. So I'm going to do another table right here called spawn points. That will start out as an empty table. And I'll check for that the same way, but there's not going to be any physics information for that. It's just going to be a point. Like, it's going to be very bare bones. So I think I'm just going to copy this part right here. And I believe the name we used in tiled was player spawn. Yeah, player spawn. That should be fine. Okay, all this is good. It doesn't need a width or a height. I guess we could just get rid of that. It doesn't matter, actually. All this stuff we don't need. But we do need a direction. So that's going to be direction equals... Oh yeah, I completely forgot, actually. Our portals need an ID. You remember we have that custom property in tiled. So it has a map ID which tells the program which map to load. So I'll put that in here. I could just say map ID equals, and then we can do v properties. This is how you get the custom properties. You say v dot properties, and then we can say map ID. And hopefully that should have it. We could do something similar with the spawns. So here, instead of map ID, it's going to be direction. Oops. And then we can say ID equals... Well, actually, one interesting thing is, remember I have all my spawn points as a table. Later on, we're going to be searching that table to find the spawn points. So I could actually create a dictionary with that table, and I can use that ID to search the dictionary. But I might also want to store it on the spawn point itself, so I'm going to include that. I believe it was just ID. Okay. In the case that it's a player spawn, I'm going to add it to the maps table. So it's going to be this dot spawn points, and then we could actually add it like a dictionary. So we could do this dot or e.id, and that's going to equal e. Okay. So when we search this dictionary right here with that ID, it's going to pull up all that data. So now that we have the portals and we have the spawn points, we need the player to be able to detect when the players collided with the portal, change the map, and then grab all of the data. Well, it needs to grab the portal's map ID data to tell the program which map to load, and then it needs to grab the spawn point data. So let's do that now. Oh, I made a little mistake here. We don't want this to be an entity, and we don't want to add it to this table. What I'm going to do is just rename this. I'll just call that S for spawn point. And everything will be the same except for this. Okay. So this is going to be independent of the other entities. First things first, we need to do something when the player actually collides with the portal. I'm going to do it here in the onCollision, just like with the coin. I could add this function to the portal object itself, but the thing is, the player is the only thing that's going to be colliding with it, so it's much better just to put it inside the player collision. It also keeps the code cleaner because I don't have all of these callbacks everywhere. So what I'm going to do is else if other dot is active and other dot tag equals entity tag dot portal, just like with the coin. Only this time we need to do something to change the map. I could just call the change map function directly, but if we do that, we're going to have a problem. It's going to be the same thing we had before when we tried to disable the bodies, that all of this is happening inside of the collision callback. So if I change the map, what is going to happen? It's going to call the map unload function, and as you recall, that actually deletes all of the bodies. But if we delete all of the bodies inside of the collision callback, that it's going to throw an error. So we need to do something else. But before I tackle that, I want to deal with the issue of spawn points and using the data to actually position the player. So up here in the player constructor, if you remember how we're dealing with the player's direction, we have these 4 frames right here. And then we're actually setting the current one with this variable. So what I want to do is actually incorporate that into the constructor. I'm going to pass in a direction, and then instead of this string, it's going to be whatever is passed in. And then the other thing I'm going to do is create a little helper function. So this is another way we could set the player's position. Okay, and that's always good in case you want to teleport the player within the same level if the player is already created. So I'll save that. Now I also need to change my map. So in the map constructor, we need some way to get the spawn ID, so I'm going to actually pass that in. And the other thing we want to do is we want to have a default value for the player's direction. So you remember, this is if there's already a player object in the map. But if we're using the spawn point to load the player, it should be fine because we could just simply reposition this. And the way we'll do that is we'll make sure every single object is loaded because we need to make sure there actually is a player. So we can do if, first of all, if spawn ID, and we're storing all our spawn points in this table right here. So we need to check if the spawn ID is correct. So we can do if spawn points spawn ID. So if that exists, then we can actually use that. Next, we need to check to see if we actually have a player loaded. But first we'll see if there isn't a player, so if not this dot player, then we can say this dot player equals player new. And we can use the spawn points position. So this dot's, actually I'll store that in a separate variable. So I'm going to do local s equals this dot spawn points, just so I don't have to type all this out every time. I can do instead s.x, s.y, and then s.direction. Yeah, I believe it was direction. Yeah. Okay. That should be good. But if we don't have a player, or sorry, if we do have a player, we can just simply do this dot player set position, and then the same thing. Oops. Something's gone wrong here. Oh. I'm supposed to include that here. Oops. It's amateur hour today. Okay. There, I think that should cover it. So now when we load the map, it's actually going to position the player correctly. Otherwise, it's going to fall back to one that's already there. Back inside main, we need a way to change our map safely without worrying about the physics callback. What I'm going to do is create a global data object. So it'll be g next map equals, and that's going to be a table of its own. It's going to be next map ID equals nil and spawn ID equals nil. So as you can imagine, this data is going to be populated every time the player steps on a portal. But how do we actually change the maps? Well, we're going to check this every single frame. So the way we're going to do that is a function. And this function is going to return a Boolean, so we'll know whether or not we should change maps. And it will be true if next map ID. So if we actually have an ID ready, then we'll return true. And we're going to check that in our update loop. Over here, we're going to say if check next map, if that's true, then we're going to change the maps and then return. So what's going to happen is none of this is going to be updated. It's not going to be updated until we've changed our map. So we could do change map, and then we'll pass in that ID, which was g next map dot next map ID. Oh, we also need to pass in the spawn point. So I think with the change map function, I'm gonna add in a spawn point as well. So when we create our map, we could pass that in too. And it doesn't actually need to be anything. It could be nil, because we're checking to see if it's nil. And one other thing is we need to get rid of that data afterwards. So I'm going to do g next map. Well, actually, I don't want to couple this to this function because I want this to be more of a generic function, a reusable function. So what I'm going to do is actually put it here. And then the spawn ID will also be nil. Oh, sorry, I made the same mistake. Next map. A lot of coding today. Okay, so it's going to change the map. It's going to set this back to nil, so that when it checks it again, it's going to return false, and then it's going to run the rest of the code. Now the last thing we need to do is actually set these variables in the player class. I'll save that, and in the player, instead of changing the map, well, we could set the variables directly, but I guess to be more like a traditional object-oriented programmer, I'm going to create a setter function. And just because I like spending a lot of time on this stuff. So, function set next map, and it's going to be map ID and spawn ID again. So it'll be G next map dot next map equals map ID, and then G next map dot spawn ID equals spawn ID. And with that out of the way, we could actually make this local. So that's one way you can create encapsulation in Lua, actually. You could have a global variable that's local to the file, but then have a global function that's available throughout your whole program. That's one thing I like to do in order to keep things encapsulated, so I can't accidentally change these variables from somewhere else. I'll save that. So now we can do set next map. And as a bonus, we can just put all of this on one line, too. So we have a problem because we need to get others data. So we know that other is going to be a portal, and the portals have the IDs, don't they? Yeah, the portal has the map ID. But it does not have the spawn ID. I seem to have forgotten to add that. Okay. I believe it was spawn ID. The properties. I think with just that one change, it should be enough. So back in player, I can do other dot map ID and other dot spawn ID. Okay. That was a lot of coding, but I think now we have a robust map loading system. Now the moment of truth, whether or not this thing works. Oops. Well, I made a mistake. So back in the map, I made this v.w. It's actually supposed to be v.width and v.height. And the same thing here. Okay, all good. Let's try that again. Okay, we got our player, and let's see. Well, we don't have a debug render for the portals, but let's just assume it's there. Oops. Again, something's happened. Okay. I spent some time playing around with it, and I realized I forgot to insert the player in the entities table here. This may be another reason why it's not a good idea to do things this way, but here's a little band-aid fix. And the other thing, I think, is when we change the maps here, I forgot to pass in the spawn ID. So we gotta do that too. It'll be spawn ID. Now hopefully those two things will fix it. Let's see. Okay, the moment of truth. Yes! Oh, all that blood, sweat, and tears. Well, I don't know why, though, the other spawn point didn't work that time. More debugging. I figured out the mistake. I made this mistake before with Box 2D. When you're using a physics body, you need to reset the position of both the object and the body, because usually one feeds off the other, so it's good to set them both at the same time. Now it should work. Okay, the moment of truth. Can we go back? Yes, we can go back, and we're in the correct spawn position this time. Great. And those coins I put in are there, which is fine. Everything seems to be working correctly. Well, I know that was a lot of work in this video, but you know, this is one of the more important things, being able to change your maps, and especially to do it with the physics system, because there's a lot of gotchas with that, especially with the callbacks. So my approach is one way to do it. I don't know if it's the best way to do it. If you have your own little workaround, let me know in the comments. But I'm just glad the whole thing is actually working now. So if you want to create like a large-scale adventure game, you've got the building blocks for that you can now traverse a larger world. In the next video, I want to cover animated tiles finally. And if there's time left over, I want to wrap things up by doing a few finishing touches. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, like and subscribe. Ciao.